a full complement of member councillors, and we welcome Councillor Balden Lumsden and Councillor Tozer, who are joining us today. No leave of absence. Confirmation minutes can stay started. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Councillor Gates, do you want to go through those?
Yes, please, Chairman. I'll be leaving the room for item 6.5, the special delegations, which have already been decided. I'll be leaving the room for that one. And 6.8, I need to make a declaration. Would you like me to make them all now? There's three.
I think that's the idea, yeah.
Okay, sure. So on 6.5, I received a donation from Place Design in 2011-14, and in 2016 that was refunded in full, and also from Arcadis. So Arcadis presents a prescribed interest for me. That's why I'll be leaving the room. Do you need to know the amounts there on the screen?
Maybe just read some of it out. I'm not sure where we landed on what the requirements are for actually.
Well, as long as it's on the screen, I've been advised that's fine. But right. I received $1,950 from an employee of Arcadis in 2014, $1,850 in 2015, and in 2016, $2,500, which I gave back in its entirety. However, it still represents a prescribed interest, so I will be leaving the room and not participating in the debate.
Okay, and
with regard to Place Design, it was $1,410 in 2011, $1,850 in 14, and $1,850 refunded in full in 2016. So that's a declarable conflict, but because of the Arcadis one, I'll be out of the room anyway.
Which item? So that relates to item 6.5 as well?
Correct.
Okay. All right, so
do you want me to leave and vote on that?
Not just yet, no.
Okay.
And then 6.8?
6.8 relates to Robina projects, and because this item deals with the Robina Land Corporation, I actually don't know what the relationship is, but I would be comfortable making a declarable conflict of interest that I received $1,250 from Robina projects in 2016. But I've had no discussion with any party related to the report. It says application to report. And I would like to remain in the room and participate.
Okay. Councillor Forster.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Just so that I can properly manage my own participation in the matter, I just want to bring the meeting's attention to the fact that my wife works for Bond University, who have interests in this significant area of the Gold Coast, and I think own a couple of developable parcels. Some of the mapping also includes reference to Varsity College, who I've attended ticketed events at in my capacity as the local area councillor, and my brother lives out of the mapped area, but close to a road, Tuggerah Close, which is referred to in the maps. I've just brought this to the attention of the meeting, not because I intend making a declarable conflict of interest, because I'm satisfied personally that we're dealing with a matter that affects a significant number of people in the local government area. But if any of my colleagues had questions or wished to deal with this procedurally, happy to do so. And I raise this merely because it would affect my ability to participate in Councillor Gates's DCOI.
That's fine, thank you. Does anyone have any questions or want to raise any matters in relation to Councillor Forster? Okay. So, Councillor Gates, just going back to your substantive declaration. So, you are making a declarable conflict of interest and you'd like to remain in the room. Would someone like to move something in relation to that participation? All right, well, Councillor Forster.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm happy to move that Councillor Gates may participate in the decision despite the Council's conflict of interest because the matter at hand stands to affect a significant number of people in the local government area. Over multiple decades. And so any interest of Robina Group is minor compared to the community interest which is being served by the proposed consultation exercise. Yeah. That's all right.
Okay, thank you. All right, anyone want to speak to that? All right, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Councillor Hamill, Councillor Owen Jones, Councillor Peter Young, Councillor Vorster, Councillor Pauline Young, Councillor O'Neill, Councillor Caldwell. Against, and Councillor Gates did not vote and will now remain in the room for item 6.8. All right, councillors, so we will unstar 6.5, which needs to be dealt with separately for Councillor Gates's departure. Yeah, Councillor Peter Young.
Could we please unstar 6.2 at the request of Councillor McDonald, who's not here but who's provided some input? Thank you.
Councillor Vorster.
6.1, please, and 6.4 and 6.8.
Okay. So that relieves. Sorry, Councillor Owen Jones. Okay. I just wonder whether, for the sake of neatness, should we just unstar 6.6 and 7 and then deal with those together, Mick? Councillor Owen Jones.
Mr. Chair, if it helps, I only have a really quick question just regarding the proposed penalty for effectively the private certification.
Okay, that's fine. All right, let's unstar 6.6 and 6.7. All right, so the remaining start items are 3 and 6.3. Someone like to move the start items? Moved by Councillor Gates, seconded by Councillor O'Neill. I'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. All right, we'll move to 6.1. Councillor Vorster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wondered whether city officers had a brief presentation. Could I ask that question?
Yes.
No. Oh, here we go.
It appears they have a presentation.
Great.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, councillors. Good morning, Councillor Vorster. Today's presentation is on a commercial premises massage parlour in Robina. The site is Unit 8, 492 Christine Ave, and this is an application under the FDA, not the planning scheme. The site is within the Robina Central Planning Agreement area. The subject premises is on the screen. It's Unit 8. It consists of part of 16 tenancies in 492 Christine Ave. Currently, councillors, there's a real sort of mix of uses on the site. There's 2 massage parlours, there's a nail studio, beautician, real estate agent, a couple of tax consultants. They're 3 stories in height, these are buildings, and they were approved originally for sort of a mixed-use type arrangement where people would live in the top 2 floors and work down the stairs. This was 1992, the approval first came in, and over the years it sort of morphed into commercial premises on the bottom with people still living upstairs, but primarily the people living upstairs have no nexus with the uses below. Funnily enough, the subject application, the lady who runs it, she actually lives upstairs, so I think she's probably the only one who's actually sort of conforming with the original intent. The original intent was more sort of small-scale office. these uses tend to be now more commercial, shops, beauticians, massage parlours. At number 12, 492 Christine Ave in 2018, there was another FDA approval for a massage premises on the site. So consistently, officers have considered commercial premises to be the appropriate use when assessing beauticians, nail therapy and massage parlours on this land. Here's a floor plan inside our commercial premises massage parlour. There are 3 treatment rooms. You can see a reception, and at the back in pink you'll see stairs leading up to the residential component on levels 2 and 3. Here's just an aerial photograph. It's nestled between the Robina Town Centre and the Varsity train station on Christine Ave. That's just a contextual aerial for your information. And here's just a map showing the Robina Central planning area in hatched yellow, and to the north and the east in the reddy pink area, that's the Planning Act, that's the city plan. So that just shows that it is located in the Robina Central planning area. And it's not under the Planning Act or the city plan, so it's regulated under a plan of development under the RCPA, the Robina Central Planning Act, and we're in the Southern Vale precinct. And basically, councillors, the assessment of the commercial premises is very limited, really. It's just down to car parking and general amenity concerns. And in the report that you have, officers have done an assessment on car parking and amenity. Officers are of the opinion there are very, very little amenity concerns with a commercial premises massage parlour operation. Officers have looked at hours of operation as probably the strongest consideration in terms of regulating this. And the hours of operation are that it ceases at 8 p.m. at night. So we thought having a massage parlour in this location operating after 8 p.m. could result in adverse amenity impacts. So that's why we've limited it to 8 p.m. That's the end of my presentation. I'm here to field questions.
So I had a few questions, Councillor Caldwell. Fine.
Councillor Vorster, then Councillor Peter Young.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask a few questions on behalf of my community as the local area councillor. Mr Chairman, could I just ask Rod, through you to Roger, just to provide a little bit of background as to what may have prompted the lodging of this FDA?
Through you, Mr Chair, Council received a complaint from a member of the public.
That was me, by the way.
Yeah. And as a result, an inspection officer visited the site, did some research. There was obviously some evidence of the massage parlour possibly being used for other services other than strictly massage. The proprietor made some changes, including putting a sign in the reception area saying there's no sexual services on offer, took down an advertisement from the paper. And council officers also issued what's called a warning notice. It couldn't be a show cause notice. You're all familiar with show cause notices. Show cause notices are under the Planning Act, as this is under the RCPA. We issued a warning notice, and as a result, they made this application for an FDA application seeking approval for a commercial premises. If there are any questions on the specifics about compliance, we do have Vicky Bennett from Development Compliance here.
Mr Chairman, Councillor Tozer just took me aside just to flag the fact that in his view, perhaps I may need to manage a potential conflict here. I don't believe that's the case, because and I'll walk through the circumstances of me raising this concern. But as councillors, we often will drive through our communities and report issues that may need to be investigated, whether they're potholes, dead or dying trees, and what have you. And where I had a reasonable suspicion that there was an unlawful land use being carried out, I did what any of us would do and raise a CR. And it so happened that the city officers then took the step of acting on that CR and investigating the issue. I see that as me carrying out my usual business as councillor. Didn't lodge a formal complaint, I merely asked for an investigation. So if there are any concerns, I'm happy to deal with it. I'm in your hands, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I think Councillor Tozer was probably getting to the point that...
You weren't disclosed as the complainant and then you self-disclosed
Yeah.
as the complainant, and I thought, let's just address that.
With most CRs, we don't become a decision maker in a planning matter. So, Councillor Gates, sorry.
I just wanted to ask Councillor Vorster, through you, Chairman, if he has an open and persuadable mind on the report that's before us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was involved in, I think, an earlier delegated decision to approve a massage parlour in the same complex. So on that basis, I genuinely have an open and persuadable mind. However, I do have some specific questions regarding this development application that I would like addressed, because the circumstances around its lodging are quite different.
Okay, I'm satisfied with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, just so all of the facts are on the table, Mr. Chairman, I was, as I said, involved in a decision to approve a massage parlour at the same complex, and I recalled at the time that certain conditions were placed on that business, and when reading the tributes section of the Gold Coast Bulletin, I happened across an advertisement under the heading Adult Relaxation, which read in part, April at Robina, new massage centre opening, discount on sensual erotic touch, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. with a Sunday special, with a phone number and the address. And the contents of that advertisement I actually thought related to the earlier approval. So I then asked city officers to make sure that that earlier approval were adhering to their development matters. Turned out that this was a second massage parlour, and then obviously there was some warning letter sent to this second massage parlour, which prompted the development of the final development of application. So, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask if we have the city officers that were involved in the compliance matter, whether they were reasonably assured by the applicant that moving forward they would not be carrying out sensual erotic touch activities on the site. Because I understand that there was some interaction between city officers and the applicant.
Morning, everyone, through the chair. I originally went out there after I was advised, and I took the ad out and showed the person that was operating. They assured me that they would cease. I've carried out further inspections, and I actually went online yesterday. All advertising has been removed. They've got signage now placed in the foyer that they do not offer any sexual favours. So with that, we've got no evidence that they're still continuing. Whether they'll start up again or not, we would just have to take it case by case.
Mr. Chairman, through you, could I just ask that that sign that's been erected inside of their premises, plainly that's been a little bit persuasive to your thinking. In your professional judgment, do you believe that signage can dissuade an unlawful activity to be carried out? In other words, does it provide some support for any development approval that council could grant?
Through the chair, well, yes, but the thing is, like everyone, no one's ever tells the truth, really.
Sure.
So as I said, they've removed all advertising. They've got the signage up, which they didn't have prior to my original visit. So with that, there's no further evidence that we've got to say that they are doing it anymore.
Okay. Well, for the moment, Mr. Chairman, those are my questions. Thank you.
Through the chair.
Roger.
Further to Vicky's comments, I visited the site on Monday. I saw the sign in the foyer, and I asked the lady, do you do any other services apart from massage? And she said no. Also, I'd like to bring to your attention the Prostitution Act 1999, which is actually thicker than the Planning Act.
How much thicker?
33 pages thicker.
Okay.
But anyway, this Act has a regulatory body called the Prostitution Licensing Authority. They are the body responsible for regulating sexual activity on these premises, not the council. The applicant has applied for commercial premises for a massage parlour. That is what we're assessing today. If there are issues about what's going on and of a sexual nature, with the possibility that it's prostitution, the Prostitution Licensing Authority are the regulatory body, not us. Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Young, did you have a question before I...
This was already raised, thank you.
Councillor Vorster.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask, does council have any role, say we grant them an approval and this gets up, does council have any role in investigating allegations of prostitution being carried out at the site, or do we merely make a referral to this other body?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is a good question. Our jurisdiction is in relation to what's in the RCPA and the Plan of Development. Quite clearly, under the Prostitution Act, complaints about prostitution or sexual activity are to be forwarded to the Prostitution Licensing Authority for their attention. So we would be a referral. We could make a complaint to the PLA, yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, through you again to Roger or Vicky, maybe Roger. Is there a different land use definition under the RCPA or in our city plan that deals with a business that might provide sensual erotic touch services? And I guess I'm asking this question because I'm intrigued to know whether, say there were allegations of prostitution occurring at the site, I want to stress allegations, surely that creates a land use issue and therefore we would have skin in the game.
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Chair, under the Prostitution Act, a premises where there is 2 or more people providing sexual services is considered to be a brothel.
Okay.
That is a land use. It's actually a regulation from state government too under the Prostitution Act. So you would need a licence under the Prostitution Act, but it is actually a land use. But you have to have 2 or more people performing sexual activity.
So if there is one person at this premises that is alleged to be providing sexual services, that would not trigger a land use issue, and it would merely be a referral to the prostitution regulator.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yeah. In fact, one person providing sexual services on that site would not be defined as a brothel or a prohibited brothel, and it would not trigger any new land use definition either under the Planning Act or the RCPA.
And does this say that this application was being lodged somewhere where the city plan applied and not the RCPA? Would there be a different assessment threshold or approach that would be taken? I'm just trying to see whether, you know, this is more permissible in Robina than it is elsewhere in the city because of the state legislation.
Through you, Mr. Chair, not the easiest question to ask, because the RCPA is a completely different legislative framework to the Planning Act. The Planning Act has more rigour around the assessment. But in relation to assessment benchmarks for amenity, car parking, height, site cover, all of those, there is a more thorough assessment under the Planning Act for those bulk and location and transport matters. In relation to what you're referring to, no.
All right, and just lastly, Mr. Chairman, this is part of a community title scheme, right? So this is a unit within a community title scheme. I always laboured under the assumption that when there's a proposed different land use that's being sought, that body corporate consent, because consent's a big issue, is required. Is that generally the case with the city plan? And if so, does that apply here in the RCPA?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it doesn't in this case because the buildings are all existing. This is purely just a change of use in an existing tenancy. The existing tenancy is with its own exclusive use area. There is no impact upon the common area other than driving in and parking. Those do not require the consent of the body corporate for that. As it's within the exclusive use area, they do not need body corporate consent.
And that's the same in the city plan as it is the RCPA?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's the same with the city plan. But can I just clarify, if there was impact upon the common area, that would require the consent of the body corporate.
So just on that, through you again, Mr. Chairman, there was a floor plan that we saw on an earlier slide. Could I just understand whether this approval, right, so we've got their private residence area, right? So does this potential approval limit the provision of massage services to the 3 indicated treatment rooms, or would it permit the carrying out of massages, for example, in an upstairs bedroom?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, we're potentially today approving this plan. So this plan is the approval. If they were choosing to have massages on the upper levels, that would be in contravention of the overarching approval.
Right. And could I just get a handle on the role of the shower? Is that proposed to be included as part of the approval for clients to use, for example, or for staff?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do not have information about the role of the shower.
No worries. All right, thank you.
Any other questions, or should we move to contemplation of the resolution? Okay, would someone like to move the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Gates, seconded by Councillor Pauline Young.
Mr. Chairman, could I, at the appropriate time, suggest perhaps an amended condition of approval that requires some signage to be erected at the entrance to the establishment, just to try and reduce the burden on our development compliance team who are stretched? Yep.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we're able to provide a condition. It will probably replicate what's in the foyer, which set up, this is John Neal. John was the assessing officer who put together a very comprehensive report. So, hi John. We're happy to put a condition requiring a sign to be put up in the front.
Mr. Chairman, through you to Councillor Gates, would you be happy to move an approval that required the erection of a sign? In which case I'll probably not find my way to support the application at this time, but I'm thankful to Councillor Gates for doing her best to finesse the...
So we'll just put it extra.
Okay. So can we just... Roger, do we need to add that in somewhere, or just...
Through you, Mr. Chair, we can probably do a amenity. There's the hours of operation. We could make that 3A, and we could put a 3B, that there'd be a sign saying that this premises doesn't offer any sexual services.
Yes.
Yep. At the entrance.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, moved by Councillor Gates, seconded by Councillor Pauline Young. Did you want to speak to that, Councillor Gates?
Yes, just very, very briefly, Chairman. I think no one is 100% comfortable with this application, but it is a commercial premises, and on the information that's been brought before us today, there's very little that our questions or our suspecting that this might be used for other uses. There's not a lot we can do at this point in time, so let's just hope, and I'm sure the development compliance officers will keep an eye on things to make sure that this operation is strictly governed in accordance with the conditions of approval that may be supported today.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak against? Councillor Vorster.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman, and I just want to thank Councillor Gates for making an effort to improve the City Officer recommendation with that extra signage requirement. Look, Mr Chairman, I'm very pro small business, but as a policymaker, I want to make sure that we are supporting a diversity of businesses in and around our major centres, including at Robina Town Centre. And I'm not personally satisfied that we need multiple massage parlours operating out of this very small mixed-use development. I actually believe that there is no need for us to be approving this land use, and I'm very uncomfortable that the affected community title scheme hasn't had a role in informing our development assessment process. I'm also very cognisant of the burden that's placed on our development compliance team, investigating suspicions of unlawful land use. They're a very stretched team, stretched very thin, and I just don't think that this particular approval will make their job any easier, given the history of this applicant. So, like Councillor Gates, I hope the applicant adheres strictly to the conditions of approval. I'm passing no judgment on their conduct moving forward, but plainly there have been issues historically, and I'm not sure that the public interest has, those concerns have been overcome today with what's proposed. I don't think a massage parlour needs to be operating at 8 p.m. on a Sunday, for example.
Okay, anyone else want to speak for the motion? Otherwise we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? That's carried. Name recorded, Councillor Vorster in negative. Okay, item 6.2.
I asked for this to be unstarred. I was approached by Councillor McDonald, the Divisional Councillor, last night. I think most councillors are aware, and indeed officers are aware, and have prepared a draft motion for refusal, and I would like to introduce that motion, which I think the officers can present to us on the screen, and I won't be able to speak to it at length.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Look, as you can see, there's 3 of these short-term accommodation matters today. One was at Robina, which we're going to deal with, recommended for refusal. 2 in Palm Beach, recommended for approval, one of which was item 6.3 that we've already dealt with. So it's probably helpful if we get a short presentation just to help explain some of the differences between them, and so we can have an understanding of this particular application.
Two Palm Beach applications for short-term accommodation together. Happy to go through that.
Well, I think that'll probably be useful anyway.
Sure, yep. As I mentioned through the chair, we're here to discuss this morning items 6.2 and 6.3, notwithstanding that 6.3 has already been endorsed. And as Councillor Caldwell mentioned, you would also be aware that item 6.4 is another short-term accommodation in Robina. I'll Officers have intentionally brought all three applications to this committee at the same time so we can discuss these matters more broadly and present to you as planning officers where we consider these uses are appropriate and other areas where they're not. So the two slides that I'll be giving you a brief presentation on today are 11 Telebudget Drive and 7 12th Avenue. As you can see from the slide, the application here we're looking at 11 Telebudget Drive is located within the medium density residential zone on the western side of the Gold Coast Highway. The site's approximately 100 metres walking distance from the highway. And as you can see the zoning map there, it's surrounded by medium density residential zoning with the open space zone to the north. That open space zone that you would have seen on the previous slide is the Telebudger Tourist Park. Outside of that, land uses surrounding the site are a mixture of dual occupancies, occasional dwelling, multiple dwelling accommodations, and short-term accommodation for this particular site on the site that you can see with the blue roof on the corner of the highway adjacent to the tourist park. The other site that's very similar to this proposal, item 6.3, is at 7 12th Avenue, Palm Beach. Again, you can see it's in the medium density residential zone, 70 metres from the highway and surrounded by development within the same zoning. Context map for you there. Both proposals, and this is one of the reasons why I'm presenting them together today, as a result of a show cause notice issued for each. Officer investigations determined that it wasn't an amenity or noise-related concern. It was a member of the public that identified these sites on an Airbnb website and wrote to council to confirm they had the appropriate land use approvals.
Councillor Owen Jones.
So it wasn't necessarily, am I correct in saying it wasn't necessarily complaint driven, other than the complaint was somebody had identified that it was available through Airbnb?
That's correct.
Not a nuisance driven complaint.
Yeah, and so neither of the two properties, to the best of your knowledge, have had nuisance
That's
issues.
correct.
Thank you.
Both short-term accommodations are proposing to operate within existing dual occupancies. Each dual occupancy is 4 bedrooms each. They're proposing a maximum of 8 guests per unit, and as part of the proposal, they're proposing a strict no party policy and some restriction to outdoor areas.
That Airbnb came out very strongly against the party house type thing, which is in addition to the strength that we have in the city plan. But just as an observation, the booking platform itself reinforces what obviously those owners are expecting.
Through the chair, the slide that we're looking at now is a strategic framework map 5, identifying the coastal tourism urban strip in that yellow section that extends from Labrador all the way down to Coolangatta, and it is predominantly on the eastern side of the Gold Coast Highway. You can see those 2 stars where the sites we're discussing in question are located at the western interface of that coastal tourism strip. Now the slide I'm presenting here has a bit of text on it, is an extract of specific outcome 3.5.4.1, which you can find on page 97 of today's agenda. Essentially, this specific outcome is from the tourist economy section of the strategic framework. And it talks about having a mix of tourist accommodation predominantly on the eastern side of the Gold Coast Highway, which reflects that mapped tourism strip that we've identified on the strategic framework map. However, it does not exclude the establishment of tourist accommodation outside of that strip, only that it predominantly occurs on the eastern side of the Gold Coast Highway. Now, there are several existing short-term accommodation land uses on the western side of the Gold Coast Highway, which demonstrates that they're not exclusively on east of the highway at this point in time. They've actually been part of the Palm Beach fabric for the best part of 40 or 50 years, and they are still a part of that environment today. Further to this, you'll note on the slide part B, 4B of the same specific outcome goes on to state that outside of the key tourist areas of Surfers Paradise, Broadbeach, etc., that there are other areas where less intensive tourist accommodation can occur, in particular coastal suburbs. And Palm Beach is listed as one such suburb. Noting that point C of the same specific outcome goes on to list other suburbs where it identifies that a character and amenity should favour a strong permanent residential population as a priority over tourist-related uses. So even in that point C, it doesn't exclude a short-term accommodation from occurring in those suburbs, but it does say that they need to be appropriately developed and managed. Now, the key reason why officers are comfortable to support these two short-term accommodation land uses is to do with their proximity to the Gold Coast Highway, which also affords them particular development parameters and in turn provides an indication of the anticipated intensity of development that one might expect and consequently the anticipated level of amenity in these areas. 11 Telebudger Drive on the top of your screen there, as I said, is 100 metres walking distance to the Gold Coast Highway. It has a 3-storey and 15-metre building height designation and an RD5 density designation. And it also adjoins the existing Telebudger tourist park. Now, a site with those development parameters, from a planning perspective, is multiple dwelling territory every day of the week. 3 stories and 15 metres and an RD5. That's an urban outcome that's contemplated by the city plan. If you want to go further and talk about 7 12th Avenue, which we've supported, that's got a building height designation of 29 metres and the same RD5 designation. As we'd be aware that all blocks on the western side of the Gold Coast Highway through Palm Beach benefit from a 29-metre building height designation. So there's a fairly intense form of development contemplated on the western side of the Gold Coast Highway. Now, one would argue that probably a couple of dual occupancy developments that are 2 stories on both sites, particularly 7th, 12th Avenue, are probably an underdevelopment of the site relative to what one could easily expect to see based on those development parameters. And for that reason, officers aren't particularly concerned about a huge proliferation of these uses occurring along the western side because there is so much more development potential that these sites have within them over and above what a dual occupancy converted to a short-term accommodation land use provides. And that's also one of the other reasons why officers are happy to support this proposal, is because it is at such a low scale for a short-term accommodation use. I guess in summary, officers consider that the 11 Telebudger Drive and the 7 12th Avenue present an appropriate intensity of tourist accommodation that's proximally located on the western side of the Gold Coast Highway for those wishing to stay in a less intensive tourist environment. The applications are recommended for approval on that basis. Are there any questions?
Excuse me. Councillor O'Neill, then Councillor Vorster, then Councillor Pauline-Young.
Thanks, Chair. I too have been approached by Councillor McDonald because she does have some concerns about, especially about 11 Telebudger Drive. One of her concerns, and you've brought up the term appropriately managed, I'm guessing there's no on-site management of this proposed dual occupancy.
Through the chair, that's correct. There's no on-site manager for either of these uses.
And I was pleased to hear that this came about, the show cause notice came about not through a nuisance complaint, because I think that's where Councillor McDonald may have been going, so that's really good. I guess the second aspect I'd like to bring up, you talked about, you know, the western interface of the coastal stream there. Where would you take that western interface down? Would you take it down to Townsend Avenue? Because I think that Councillor McDonald's concerns too are about setting a precedent. Where are we going to draw the line at this, you know, the coastal stream there?
Through the chair, the Planning Assessment Branch has discussed this matter in considerable detail, and we believe through the area of Palm Beach, it's that block that fronts the Gold Coast Highway that benefits from the 29-metre building height designation and the RD5 density designation that provides a clear intent for that intensity of built form outcome, that is the extent where we consider for these land uses to be appropriate. So to provide you with a bit of context, that's approximately 100 to 150 metres west of the Gold Coast Highway, where all those lots are that benefit from those development parameters. And inside those lots...
Sorry, Mr Chairman, now that the conversation's straying into general development rights west of the M1, where 29-metre height limit might exist, I just want to flag with city officers that my wife and I own a small investment unit in Palm Beach, west of the M1, not close to these two addresses, but I suppose within that catchment. So I don't believe that either Melissa and I have standing to make a gain or suffer a loss as a consequence of these two decisions. But now that we're talking about general development rights within that area, I just want to flag that in case any councillor wish to move a procedural motion to the otherwise. All right, thank you. So I apologise for the delay. I just wanted to.
Can I just have one more question, please, Chair? You may not have knowledge of this, Adam, but do you know, leading up to the show cause notice, and there was no nuisance complaints, did you know whether it was like families using this type of accommodation, not wanting to be, you know, close on the highway or in multi-level buildings?
Through the chair, unfortunately, I don't have any of that information.
Councillor Vorster, then Councillor Pauline Young.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Just had two brief questions. Through you to Adam, I suppose the impression I get is that city officers were persuaded to support both of these applications because it represented a more palatable, less intense use of the site than you might otherwise see with an application that goes to 29 metres, right? Could I ask, though, if that was contemplated as part of the assessment process, did we also have regard to how conversion of these properties from potentially permanent rentals or owner-occupied spaces to short-term accommodation might impact housing supply? Because to my mind, that is equally a consideration that should be contemplated if we're going to be looking at alternate development outcomes.
Through the chair, officers acknowledged that concern, but when we went through the slides and the ones that we talked about today, probably this one, which is on an extract from page 97 of the report, it provides a clear indication of particular suburbs where it says, hey, we are happy to support these short-term accommodation land uses, probably over and above other areas where we'd favour a more permanent residential population. So there's a clear message there to planning officers that said there are a couple of locations, Coolangatta, Kirra, Palm Beach, Telebudger and Labrador that contemplate these uses. It's not exhaustive. It doesn't go through all the other suburbs. So to me, that provides a measured approach. I'm aware that there's potential that the use of these by short-term accommodation would take away from permanent residential uses. They could probably be used if they needed to be, if the owner chose to, for permanent residential use. It's not like you're changing the fabric of the buildings.
Right. So just to be clear, our strategic framework contemplates that Palm Beach is there to serve both the tourism economy and tourists, as well as locals and permanent residents. And this application is supported because those two have to be held in tension.
Correct, in a less intensive manner to some of those other key tourism areas.
Right, and you may not be across this, but I'm just interested in the issue of complaint. I just wonder whether we have an understanding of, when in documented history of complaint with a lack of on-street car parking, or rather parking demand being driven up by short-term stays, because very few families might have 10 people in them, right? And my grandmother was one of 10, but I don't think that's very common nowadays. So if you have potentially multiple families staying in this accommodation, it may be likely that they have more than one vehicle. Very few vehicles can fit 10 people in, for example. Does the approval contemplate that all car parking needs are to be handled on site? Or is there thought that there may be some on-street car parking overflow?
Through the chair, there are some conditions officers have recommended that talk to that particular matter, specifically condition 4 that talks about the short-term accommodation must be rented or leased with each unit as a whole, thereby trying to manage as best we can that car parking provision you're talking about. There's also a double garage for each of these uses and a driveway in front of those garages. So technically, these proposals could be AO compliant with their car parking requirements. 1 bedroom per room, they're 4 bedrooms each.
Could I just ask, though, we haven't taken the step of conditioning that all vehicles connected with the short-term stayers are to be parked securely in the garage and on the driveway. In the first instance, we haven't taken that step?
Through the chair, we haven't taken that step, as we generally don't with any development application.
Well, usually if we have a development application, and correct me if I'm wrong, for a short-term accommodation, we make sure that there is sufficient parking on site and that there is visitor car parking on site. This just happens to be a short-term accommodation development application at a much smaller scale. I appreciate that we don't mandate that they actually use what is on site, but I wonder, given the very narrow residential streets in the area, whether you might find it reasonable that we condition that the garage actually be made available to tenants rather than used as a storage area for the property owner, which might then push vehicles unnecessarily out into the street.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we've historically always allowed dual occupancies, the visitor car parking, to park on the street. With the design of these two, you can actually get a car to park on the street between the driveways. We've never conditioned. I don't think it's reasonable or relevant that we delve into conditions that requires cars to park in a garage. All our jurisdiction is to make sure that there are parking spaces available. We don't have the enforcement mechanism to ensure that garages are not full of storage and cars parked on the street. We don't have that ability. Our jurisdiction is to ensure that they are available. In relation to car parking, I think you have to put it into perspective that this type of development where dual occupancies are established and they're converted to Airbnb, we've had about 5 or 6 of these types of applications since we made a short-term accommodation land use definition back in 2016. So as Adam said, we don't consider we're going to get an influx of this type of product in this area. So I would take it that we'll have a little bit of pepper potting of these types of uses in this area. I don't think it's going to have an adverse impact upon the street environment. And I'll qualify that by saying that these are existing. We've had no complaints, and these two applications attracted 0 submissions.
All right, so just to be perfect, so that I can be perfectly clear, and I'm not trying to make life difficult for the applicants by any stretch of the imagination, but when the car parking requirements were assessed, were they assessed on the basis that there are garages available on site?
Correct.
Now, just spending a little bit of time researching Airbnb listings, there are many listings where people are not, guests are not provided access to the garage. So for me, there's a little bit of difficulty in saying we should support the short-term accommodation, which satisfies car parking requirements because there's a garage, but many Airbnb listings don't provide access to the garage. And I just need to be satisfied that given that concern, city officers actually believe it's unreasonable for us to make sure that that access to the garage is freely made available.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it'd be unreasonable to mandate that guests park in the garage, but what we could do as an alternate condition is to have a condition that says the garages are to remain free of storage and freely available to the guests.
Like, for me, that would get me over the line, because I think it's really important that when we support this sort of development, which may be unexpected to some, that we're making sure that the car parking that is available on site is made available. And they might provide a strict no party policy, right? That's, as Councillor Caldwell said, is in response to an Airbnb policy, right? Airbnb seems to have a policy where they permit hosts to lock up the garage to the exclusion of the guests. So I think we need to respond to Airbnb policy the same. So I'd be suggesting we leave those garages free of clutter and potentially available to guests.
I'm happy to include that, Councillor Vorster. The thing is that the house that's next door, who are permanent residents, could well fill their garage, and in my experience, Gold Coast residents themselves need a good spring clean to make their garages accessible for vehicles, because what's going on in every suburb is that they're being used for storage ahead of car accommodation.
I'm guilty of
so
that
we're fortunate here that we have that ability at this point to enforce that, but you know, that's probably going over and above and creating a far better and higher bar than the resident that lives next door is obliged to try and adhere to, you know. So anyway, everyone who's watching at home, go and spring clean your garages.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Adam, on page 99 of the report, where it's got the rules include the following: a maximum of 6 guests per unit at any one time. So that's guests, and then on the next line, and then a maximum of 8 visitors, being people other than the 6 guests. And then we go over to page 108 in our conditions, where it says a maximum number of occupancies, a maximum of 8 overnight guests, and then a maximum of 8 visitors. So is it 6 or is it 8 for the people who are actually staying there and staying overnight?
Through the chair, page 99 talks about an operational management plan that was provided by the applicant with the proposal that talked about a maximum of 6 guests per unit and 8 visitors.
Yep.
Each application has 4 bedrooms. I think it's probably unreasonable for officers to condition 6, given that you'd probably have 2 people in each room. So we've considered it based on its maximum occupancy at 8 persons per room.
Okay, but yet the applicant was happy with 6, but the city said that they'll accept 8. Yep, Okay. And on the other side of things, and I will be voting in support of this today. I think this is gives us that mixed tourist accommodation that we're looking for, and particularly we've got the Telebudger rec centre across the road, which has a mammoth amount of people going through that, and families come to stay locally. We've got the tourist park, which is one of our best performing tourist parks in the area, which backs onto this. So obviously there is a lot of tourist noise there, and it's every weekend. And then of course Telebudger Creek, which is a family beach, and families are looking to stay in two-level establishments that they can walk to the beach. There's a patrolled beach right in front. If they bring the family pet, we've got the big dog off-lead beach there. So for me, the positioning of this, the officer's assessment and that I'm very happy to support it, knowing that, people coming to visit the city aren't necessarily just coming to stay in a two-bedroom unit and squash the whole family, and they might want to bring an elderly relative or something like that to stay in an Airbnb for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks at a time. So I'm very happy to support this today. Thank you.
Any other questions? So, Councillor, do you just want to say yes?
Thanks, Chairman. Look, I'm comfortable with the officer's recommendation and indeed the addition of the condition that's been teased out through discussion. But I did give a commitment to Councillor McDonald, and unfortunately she's not here, so I'll introduce the motion that was prepared by officers at her request, and I think that's on the screen, which is basically that Council refuses the issue of a development permit for short-term accommodation in accordance with the following reasons. And they are presented there. I won't go into detail, but it lists 4 key reasons, including inconsistency with the Transport Code and overall outcomes and performance outcomes of the Residential Zone Code and the Strategic Framework. I can't speak necessarily in support of the motion, Mr. Chairman, but I'll leave it at that.
I think it's good to, for the sake of trying to be fair to Councillor McDonald, who was unable to attend this morning, that we at least see what the matters were that she was proposing to raise, and may do it full council, I don't know. But, yeah, Councillor Tozer.
Just, I want to get my head around the language that's used in this one. I obviously can't vote, but the predominantly low-intensity residential character of the area in which it's proposed. Today we've heard that there's 29 stories. Sorry, 29 metres. Yeah. It just occurs to me that I don't know Palm Beach very well, but is 29 metres a low intensity, or is it?
29 metres is a 9-storey mid-rise building. That's a fairly intense built form outcome. That's what we're seeing along the majority of the eastern side of the highway in Palm Beach.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we might be getting confused. So the Telebudget Drive DA, which is the one we're dealing with now, is the 3-storey area. And
okay. So
the 12th Avenue
one. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, cool. But the other one is 29 stories.
Correct.
And this one's only 15 metres, which is 3 stories. Okay, cool.
Yeah, the same residential density.
And to be fair, like in suburbia, you can't do 3-storey, 15-metre buildings, so it's not low density.
Yeah, gotcha. But I just wanted to get my head around the language being used.
Does someone want to move the officer's recommendation with the amendment? So moved by Councillor Owen Jones, seconded by Councillor Peter Young, and we'll add the additional. Yeah. Well, because Daff won't be watching, he'll be able to go back and say, "Oh, I've tried so hard." No, hi Daff. I know you'll be watching from home. And we'll just include that the garage be freely accessible for use as part of the approval. Cool. All right, did you want to speak to that, Councillor Owen Jones? No. Councillor Young? Anyone else want to speak for or against? So it's the staffing one? No, this is the approval.
Yeah.
Councillor O'Neill.
Yeah, Chair, I just want to say, look, I'm going to support the officer's recommendation, and I did did tease out some of Councillor McDonald's concerns. I was very surprised to hear that there was no submissions, because when Councillor McDonald contacted me, I thought for sure there would have been, the show cause would have been sent because there had been complaints about nuisance, and I assumed that there would have been neighbours who'd actually made submissions, and that's not the case. So I really do have to, I support the recommendation. Thank you. Well, yeah, and I do agree with Councillor Pauline Young. I know the area really well, and I know how that particular street operates, and I think it will attract more family-type residents than anywhere else.
Well, we still always have to remember that, you know, tourism is such an important component of the city's economy, and these are small things, but they're necessary to make sure that the product mix is correct. And with a growing family, I can tell you it's not getting any easier to get appropriate family accommodation. So these things actually are quite helpful. So, all right, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried.
Yeah.
It's
when you say growing family, is there news?
I think you're lying.
Mark, do you want to talk about the twins? Are you suggesting inappropriate meeting conduct?
Does the chair have personal satisfaction?
Let's see how good
by Councillor Pauline Young. Yeah. Councillor Gates.
I wasn't sure if everyone was across this one. I actually feel personally similarly to the one we've just discussed. I do understand that the strategic framework kicks in because it's an impact assessable application, but I just wondered if the officers could give me some clarity when the strategic framework focuses on the word predominantly. So there's not an expectation that these pop up everywhere in every suburb, I get that, but how much focus was there on that part of the strategic framework in deciding the recommendation, please? Because the recommendation is a refusal, and yet it's medium density. It's medium density.
Can we just clarify this? Because I thought yesterday in our discussions you said it was low density, but it seems to have the orange colour over it, not the light pink.
It says on page 97.
Yeah, I just want to hear from the officers. So can you just explain that, Roger?
Through you, Mr Chair, there's a significant contextual difference between the two Palm Beach applications and 10 Emerton Crescent. In answer to your question, Councillor Gates, predominantly was used for the other two in relation to them being within 100 to 150 metres of the Gold Coast Highway, where the city plan actually wants these uses to go. 10 Emerton Crescent is over 3 kilometres away. So, and also Emerton Crescent, even though it's medium density residential, it is within a suburban context. So that's really what we're trying to focus today, the difference between a suburban context and an urban context. We went to great lengths, Adam, in his report and presentation to actually demonstrate that because of the development parameters afforded to the two sites in Palm Beach, they were not a suburban context. Emerton is a suburban context, and it's quite funny that the two Palm Beach applications attracted 0 submissions, whereas this one in 10 Emerton Crescent is actually generating adverse impacts, and we received, I think, 12 submissions.
Okay, thank you.
Against.
Yeah, okay, I accept that. But what I'm interested in knowing is, does the definition for short-term accommodation focus only on tourism? Because I'm aware of members of my family who've wanted to come and visit and use Airbnb. They're not interested in going to the beach at all. They're interested in being close to where I might be. So does the short-term accommodation focus only on tourism, or does it contemplate people coming to our city for a short period of time for other reasons?
Through you, Mr Chair, I'll just read quickly the definition of short-term accommodation. The use of premises for providing accommodation of less than 3 consecutive months to tourists or travellers. So there's quite clearly a strong intent that short-term accommodation is really focused on tourists or travellers. 2, a manager's residence, office or recreation facilities be for the exclusive use of guests if the use is ancillary. Does not include a hotel, nature-based tourism, resort complex or tourist park. In answer to your question, it is tailored to tourists or travellers.
Okay, thank you.
I also just note that the height map seems to be 9 metres on this site. So again, that's more akin to what we would find in the low density residential area. And so I think probably what's happened here is that in order to facilitate duplexes, which is, for example, what we have in Paradise Point, you get a medium density zone with a very low height constraint and a very low density as well. So these are 1 per 250, which is, what's that, RD? What's 1 per 250?
RD3.
RD3.
Yeah.
So,
Through the chair, if you turn to page 157, there's 2 gated communities, one to the north west and one to the southeast. We're of the opinion they zoned this area for medium density residential because of the existence of those 2 gated communities. But when you actually blow out the area to a larger extent, it really is primarily a low density residential area.
all right, happy with that,
Yes,
Councillor
I'm
Gates?
happy, thank you.
All right, so moved by Councillor Vorster, seconded by Councillor Pauline Young. Councillor Vorster, did you want to speak to it?
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Only to flag that there are a few wrinkles in the original Robina master plan, and for those councillors or members of the community who would hope to find some short-term style accommodation for their friends and family, as Roger mentioned, there are 2 gated complexes, one of which is Robina Resort on Resort Drive, just a couple of streets away. So there is no shortage, I suppose, of apartment and resort style accommodation in the area. This section, though, between the 2 complexes is very, 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 very suburban, and it's also opposite Robina Common, where we now have one of the city's largest soccer clubs, together with baseball clubs. So there is a big suburban lived overlay in the area. And unlike the Palm Beach examples, this one has been subject of community complaint and community submission. So I was actually quite interested myself in how city officers supported 2 approval outcomes and a refusal in this instance, but they seem to have hit the nail on the head in terms of community aspiration and also the character of the area and its relation to other tourism infrastructure. So I'm happy enough.
And the submission map on page 171 is pretty instructive on that point as well. All right, anyone else want to speak for or against? All right, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. (6.5), Councillor Gates, if you would now like to leave the room. And just to the officers on that, I really appreciated that presentation. It was actually very good and succinct and took us to what we needed to see as a highlight of, yeah, thank you. All right, so Councillor Gates has now departed at 10:25 and we'll deal with item 6.5. Moved by Councillor Owen Jones, seconded by me. Any debate or discussion? We'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Yeah, Councillor Tozer, thanks. All right, 6.6 and 6.7. I don't know, just see. Did he have a presentation or not? I can't remember. Yeah. All right, councillor, so item 6.6 and 6.7 relate to pool safety. Now, I don't know, Darren, did you have a presentation or I just thought it might be worthwhile you putting on the record some of those highlighted points that you spoke to me about yesterday. Do you want to pop up to the mic? So 6.6 obviously particularly relates to our legislative responsibilities, and 6.7 is a bit more about some proactive enforcement. So can you just run through a quick highlights package for us?
Good morning, everyone. Darren Wright's my name, through you, Mr Chair. Thanks for this opportunity to just go through some of the pool safety requirements. There's two items before you here this morning. The first one is to deal with a Building Act requirement where we're required to provide advice to our ratepayers every 4 years just about public safety. So what we've done is created a brochure that gets attached with our rate notice. This isn't a new requirement. This happens every 4 years. So we've done it previously, I think I'll have to go back to the previous one. And this year we've tried to make it a much more user-friendly, a much more readable brochure that's useful for our ratepayers to go through to actually check what they have to do for their pool fence. That includes a frequently asked section and some obligations for the owners as a pool fence. And on the back of that item too is an extra part that we can actually do some media in the lead up to summer each year, just to keep it in the forefront of people's minds about the importance of pool safety. So hopefully that item's a fairly straightforward one. The second item is, unfortunately, the other side to the coin, where we actually have to act in a compliance role. So pool safety role is shared by three different parts of government. So the Department of Energy and Public Works, the state government actually provide the legislation and the requirements. The Queensland Building Construction Commission, they register the pools, they receive all the pool safety certificates, they licence the contractors, they licence the pool safety inspectors and maintain the register. As a local authority, our role is actually to go out on site and look and do the physical nuts and bolts and things on site to do with the pool fence to make sure it's safe. So in our development compliance area, we've got a number of dedicated officers who have got the tricky role of dealing with that and making sure that the pool fencing part of things is compliant. How we can tell if we're actually doing a good role in that is each year this report is presented to state government, and it's done by the Queensland Family and Child Commission, and it's the deaths of children and young people in Queensland. And there's a particular section in this report that deals with child drownings, unfortunately, and how pool safety affects those child drowning numbers. The good news is, since we've had the implementation of pool fencing requirements, those numbers have gone down. So the role we're trying to take in development compliance is to keep those numbers down. And as a city, going out and doing the inspection part, it's a very important role. So we get about 550 complaints that we actually have to go and look at each year. And in this role, we normally work with the owners to try and resolve the issues and use the fines as a last resort. But from that report that I just mentioned, it's pretty clear where the main problems are. And for children aged 1 to 4, drowning is still the main cause of death. Most of those drownings occur in private swimming pools. And over the last 5 years, the statistics from this book, 39% of those drownings were by pool gates being propped open. I'll just repeat that again. 39% of those child drownings, age 1 to 4 in the last 5 years, were by pool gates being propped open. That's preventable death. So in light of those figures, the reason for this motion is just to make council aware that we want to change our practice to actually have, I guess, less leniency where our officers find those gates propped open without a reasonable excuse because of that significant tie into child deaths.
Okay, thank you. I just got a slight chill at that last statistic, personally, so, yeah. Any questions, Councillor Peter Young and Councillor Owen Jones?
Thanks, Chairman. I appreciate the brevity of the enormous impact that propped open pools and pool fences and other issues can present. So I wonder about the method of advising the community that's been identified, which is the publication with the rates notice. And I wonder if instead we might have a direct mail to people who we know actually own pools. We should have those records.
Yep, through you, Mr. Chair. We do have a list of owners of pools on the Gold Coast, and if that's something that council wish to pursue. Yes.
So there's a bit of a line to balance on because we have to make sure we meet our obligation, and as I understand it, the regulations or the legislation sets out that a mail out to the whole of the rates base meets our obligation. Our list of pool owners may not necessarily be exhaustive, and so therefore we could miss some. So that's why the method of distribution has been chosen through the rates notice channels.
I can appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I think that's good for everyone to know because obviously you take your kids to someone else's pool, you may not have one yourself, but it's good for you to have that information. But I fear that most people would probably just throw out the flyer and that effort's kind of not very impacting. Perhaps we could do both.
Perhaps between now and full council, could we do some background work on what the costs of a dedicated mail out would be and how that might be able to be included as a part of it?
Thanks, Chairman.
I mean, I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but I think the council social media team seems to be doing a very good job of things like the transport strategy and a few other bits and pieces at the moment. So I actually think we'll probably get some good traction through those channels as well.
Yep.
Councillor Owen Jones, then Councillor Vorster.
So just through you to Councillor Young, I think last time we actually mailed it from memory to the water users, and there was some concern at the time that we hadn't actually got to everybody in that regards as well, because there were clearly rural properties that aren't water users but are registered for pools. So I think that the general rate base is probably a far more effective than the Gold Coast Water database, and my guess is it's probably covers far more people directly to the mailing directly to the rate base rather than targeted to the pool owner, because I think again, as Councillor Caldwell said, the problem last time was the number of pools that may not necessarily be on our database because they were pre-whenever. My question was around the introduction of a penalty for, I'm going to say, the private certifiers who do the work. And I think the report talks about that maybe being about 10 cases a year. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. I first might just a point of clarification. Pool safety inspectors are a distinct licence class within the QBCC, separate to private building certifiers. So the vast majority of pool safety certificates are issued by pool safety inspectors, although private certifiers can issue them.
Okay, so the pool safety inspectors, so I think the report indicated that there was maybe 10 times a year where we'd like to direct the penalty directly to the person that may have done the report incorrectly rather than the current regime of going through a longer process. Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, there's very low numbers of cases that would want us to take action, because these are the worst of the worst breaches that might involve pool safety inspectors that we would reserve using that fine for.
Yeah. And I think the report implied that you may have some discretion as to whether or not you fine them or not. Is that?
Yep, through you, Mr. Chair, yes.
And are the majority of those pool safety inspectors from the Gold Coast, or are there some that have that may issue certification but not actually be based in the Gold Coast local government area?
Through you, Mr Chair, I'm not aware of that information, but just intuitively I would expect that they would cross council boundaries without any issue at all. So there may be Brisbane-based pool safety inspectors who work Gold Coast, vice versa.
Yeah, so I suppose what I'd be really interested in is making sure that we concentrated on ensuring that if there were pool certificates that were issued from people outside of the Gold Coast local government area, that may indicate that maybe that they hadn't completed a site inspection, for example, and that it was maybe a cheaper alternative to getting a result, but the result is the wrong result as far as safety might be. So I'd be reluctant to see the council provide too much discretion or leniency if we had a breach with a pool safety inspector that was outside of our local government area, because I think that would, to me, indicate somebody had gone shopping for the cheapest outcome that didn't actually reconcile with what's happened on site.
Through you, Mr Chair, yeah, no, it's a good point, and the officers do use a number of discretionary factors, and that would be a very significant one, and there would be a lot of weight. If a pool safety inspector did an inspection, say, by remote, by photos or by something like that, that's certainly not acceptable in any way, shape or form, and that would be a good case to use this type of breach.
Yeah, so I like the idea of introducing it, because I think that I've recently had a Helensvale resident that had some issues trying to get a pool certified after a breach notice, and he started talking about how he had a mate up in far north Queensland that was going to help him out with the certification, and that kind of really concerned me, because if they're not physically seeing what is on site and relying on photos or videos, I just think that's where we have the challenge. So
yes.
And so, Darren, do we know roughly how many pools there are in the Gold Coast?
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's fine. Councillor Vorster.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. So we've had a general discussion on 6.6 and 6.7 together, but we haven't carried the motion for 6.6.
There's been no motions on either matter.
If we could just scroll up to the draft city officer, or sorry, not the draft, but the city officer recommendation for 6.6. I'd be interested to see an information or education campaign that also targets pool shops and pool service people, at least providing them with the offer of resources to leave behind with their clients, because there are many people that rent homes that have pools, and they're not necessarily going to be the ones receiving a rates notice or a water bill. So I just want to make sure that we're at least going the further step of making some printed resources available through the actual industry that can be left behind with homeowners to give us the best possible chance of getting coverage. Because those avoidable child deaths are shocking, and at the very least, perhaps providing that collateral to operators might educate them so that if they're attending a pool to service it, they can flag with the homeowner, hey, that you're doing the wrong thing here, propping that gate open. Here's some information that you can act on. It might just save a life. And I wonder if then when we come to 6.6, one of those channels can be pool retail stores and the service industry. Testing your support for that, Mr.
Just add a 4 that that the information be made readily available for such. It's just a bit hard to say. So we authorise that it be distributed through our channels, and maybe that the information and collateral be made available for associated industry businesses or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, look, we print, I would hate to think how many brochures we print on all manner of things. I know my front foyer is just filled with it, and none of those things generally talk to saving the life of kids. It seems we're ready to print an information thing on anything. But here we're dealing with literally a life and death matter, and if we're going to be running this campaign, I think it makes sense for us to have a printed resource that is made available to those involved in the industry and those who are actually confronted with pool safety issues. Mr. Chairman, through you to Councillor Gates, can I just say, all I'm saying is we print brochures. Let's have a stockpile of brochures, and as part of our social media campaign, invite those operators in the industry who want to be more responsible to do us a favour and distribute this information.
And I don't dispute that at all, but the point I was making, if you're going to inform pool shops and associated businesses, inform the real estate agents as well who lease the properties that you referred to, and to whom there are conditions that are applied about having a pool safety certificate, but it won't ever stop anyone propping open a gate, which we've heard this morning is of concern, but it might be able to be reinforced through those agencies as well.
So when you interjected before, I took it, when you said, how far do you go?
No.
I took that to mean, why even pursue this, because you could take it to the nth degree.
As you've clearly stated, a life's a life, and we want to avoid any possibility of that occurring as best we can. And the notification through the rates notice is ideal. It goes to, what, 240 or 250,000 people.
Yeah.
So fantastic, but let's do whatever else we can and address every possible avenue.
Right, so commercial pool service operators and leasing agents, if requested. You happy with that, Councillor Gates?
Yeah, that's great.
Other questions?
No.
All right, so Councillor Vorster, you happy to move that with your additional 4? Councillor Vorster? Moved by Councillor Vorster, seconded by Councillor Owen-Jones. Do you want to speak to it further?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Right, item 6.7. Moved by Councillor Owen-Jones. Oh, we've broken the system. Moved by Councillor Owen-Jones, seconded by Councillor Pauline Young. Anything further, Councillor Owen-Jones? Take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Item 6.8.
So through you, Mr. Chair, councillors, you have some maps in front of you, hopefully. I think I can see some. The online agenda had the correct maps in it, but for some reason the printed agenda didn't. So the correct maps are the maps that you have in front of you.
I've already had mine, Mr. Chairman, so
Councillor Owen-Jones, seconded by Councillor Vorster. Did you want to speak to it, Councillor Owen-Jones? Did you want to speak to it, Councillor Vorster? Let's hear from the honourable member for Robina, Varsity and Frescott Park.
and the bit of Burley Waters with no water.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to really thank city officers for doing something that this council has hoped for many years, and that is to delve into the business and understand what the risks are and what the opportunities are for this critically important part of the Gold Coast. And I say critically important not because I'm a self-styled Mr. Robina, but rather because Robina sits at the geographic heart of the Gold Coast. And unlike many other parts of the Gold Coast, there's an opportunity to curate development outcomes because we're dealing with very large greenfield sites. So in the same way that we might seek to curate outcomes at the Health and Knowledge Precinct, we should at least be paying as much attention to this part of the Gold Coast. What this body of work attempts to do is to do something the state government has refused to, and that is to seek input from the community, as big a catchment as possible, to understand what their aspirations are for this part of the Gold Coast. And it makes no presumptions about the original master plan. It's very forward-looking, and I actually think a very exciting body of work. And for those councillors who don't represent this particular area, can I just say, I believe your constituencies will be affected by the work that's carried out here, because what is proposed is a series of land use and development outcomes that can potentially be the catalyst of excellent east-west public transport outcomes, so that all of the money we've spent investing in light rail and heavy rail as ratepayers and taxpayers can be leveraged to provide greater economic and social benefits. What it also does, Mr. Chairman, is recognise that the city has embarked on a plan to deliver the second stage of the Green Heart, and we want to make sure that we're actually leveraging that investment and putting people within the orbit of that park so that we maximise the social utility of the Green Heart, given the significant amount of funding that's required. What I'm particularly excited about, Mr. Chairman, is that it ties together not only community aspiration, but the aspirations of the development sector, and has regard to some development approvals to build something that's cohesive. So rather than taking a patchwork approach to development, this body of work tries to tie it all together to protect livability, economic prosperity, and I think to realise the vision of Robina as it was set all those many years ago as a living paradise. Councillor Tozer spoke to me just before about some of the benefits that might flow to his adjacent community of Mudgeeraba, and while they don't necessarily form part of the map here, I know his community will benefit from road upgrades, public transport linkages, and also the provision of better services on their doorstep. Ultimately, the work that we're doing is to have moral authority. It will require the endorsement of the state government and Robina Land Corporation to progress, but it is such a thorough body of work already and has such a good process about it that it would be a brave government to ignore it. And again, I just want to thank the city officers for doing something I've been begging and pleading for so very long, and giving us as a council the opportunity to make sure that we've got a fully functioning, prosperous, higher order centre that can accommodate more housing without sacrificing lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Tozer.
Yeah, look, I just want to echo Councillor Voss's commentary on that. It's really quite impossible for any resident of Division 9 in the suburban area to get anywhere in the city without going through this map. And so I've been really chuffed to have the officers come and brief me on it and keep me across it. Whilst it's not my division, it's really critically important that we get good outcomes there. The only question I'd have is that on all the underlying maps, Firth Park is only representing 1/4 of the area. There's only 1/4 of that lot is green. So if we can just expand that green space up to the M1, it's all one precinct now.
Through the chair, yeah, that's been organised this morning. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. It's all good. The whole thing's, yeah.
All right. Anyone else want to speak for or against? All right, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. All right, now, councillors, we've just got a couple of items of general business. So, Councillor Gates, do you want to bring up your...
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I've been concerned for some time about estate signage and entry statements and council's inability to make repairs when they become damaged or deteriorated. So in discussion with the officers, I've had some words reviewed, And I would like to move that the Director, Planning and Environment, review the Land Development Guidelines, City Plan Policy SC 6.1.2, landscape work, and the standard conditions attached to development approvals regarding entry statements, signage and structures, having regard to the proposed size and scale of any signage, its location on public land and not on privately owned land, and consideration be given to a timeframe for signage and its possible subsequent removal at the cost of the developer. And that relates also, Chairman, to branding. I have a number of estate signs that have been there perhaps for a decade or more that still bear the branding of the developer, and they're on privately owned walls. Yep. Which make it very difficult for council to act as those signs deteriorated. I've got another one at Coomera Springs. I've got some on the east side at Coomera where there's vines and weeds that have grown all through the signage that's probably 150 centimetres tall. It's just an eyesore. So this will help us all. I'm sure we've all encountered these similar problems, and the Director has confirmed that they will be able to be addressed. Thank you.
So thanks, Councillor Gates, and seconded by Councillor Petty-Young. All right, so questions, Councillor Vorster.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Through you to the Director, is this currently governed, or I know there's reference to a city plan policy here, but is this an administrative policy or is it a policy that's contained in the city plan? And I'm asking because usually a general business item would ask for a report to be brought back to council, but this is silent on that. Would you take this as a direction to then go make amendments as you see fit, and what's the process for change?
Through you, Mr Chair, Councillor Forster, we would come back to council once we have done the work. It is contained in the city plan. Obviously LGIP in some cases does mention desired centres of service and things like that as well, but it's not an administrative policy. Is that right?
Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right, we'll take the vote on that. All in favour? Against? Carried. And enough mix here. So, councillors, I think also on your desk has been circulated the development activity report for April to June, which concludes the financial year. If you turn to page 3, you'll see up in the top right-hand corner the number of 5449 for the total development applications for the year, which is a world record for Gold Coast City Council. But in all seriousness, very big numbers and a healthy increase of about 500, I think, from memory on last year. Just trying to remember the exact numbers. So strong numbers. On that page, there's a highlights package of where we're at. The the building approval numbers slightly down in this quarter from a very high base, obviously. But for the year, again, another record number as well. So we're seeing strong DA activity. We're then seeing strong construction activity. So if I'm happy to move that this report is noted as this, and seconded by Councillor Owen Jones. And I just wanted to extend my thanks to Mick and his team in particular, because I think this puts on paper how busy the officers actually have been behind the scenes, and they're under an incredible amount of pressure in terms of the expectations of the development sector and the community and us as a group of councillors, and they continue to deliver. So thanks to Alicia for her leadership of the department, and to Mick and all of the workers, particularly down on level 2, who continue to grind out the results. So thank you to you all. Yeah.
I just know in the dealings that I have in the north of the city and how frequently I call on the officers, and I'd just like to say congratulations to Alicia, because there's a great attitude that exists within the planning department at the moment, and it is significantly different in my experience. And Mick and Roger, under their guidance, it's fantastic to have that level of support from the officers. So thank you.
And I mean, today, like, I genuinely meant what I said to Brownie earlier, like, just a really good level of technical knowledge packaged up exactly how we need to hear it for today's purposes, and they continue to do that time and time again. So very good work. So
good leadership.
Councillor Jones.
So could I just ask a question just in regards to the development application? So that doesn't reflect the number of dwellings that have been applied for. Is there an easy way that we can identify what that might look like, Meg?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's not. It's doable. It'd be a manual task for the officers. At the moment, our reporting systems just sort of don't let us have that info readily available. But it is something we could work out. It'll just take a bit of effort.
And I think we know that there's always this difference between the number of things we approve, whether or not it's dwellings or what it might look like, and then what ends up actually getting built. And likewise, these numbers don't include any of the actions that the state government may be doing in regards to constructing dwellings in the affordable housing or social housing space.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, no, they don't.
Yeah, I to tease that out, like, I mean, notionally, the city can't really be doing anything more than what we're doing at the moment in regards to delivering housing outcomes, because we've got a record number of development applications, which is kind of indicative that we're working as hard as we can. What we can't see is what the state might be doing in that space as well. So on one hand, as councillors, we may receive criticism from the state for not doing enough in that space, but we actually can't see what's being done. And I recall that Councillor Vorster, I think, however long ago, asked for some idea of what the state were doing, and I don't think we've had a response yet.
So I actually had a similar question, but I was going to ask it at governance, thinking that once the development application was, or the plan was sealed or something, there's obviously some sort of transfer where it becomes a rateable property in some sort of category. And I'm not sure whether that would be a planning and environment exercise or whether that would be an org services, but it occurred to me that there would be a list of new properties that have, in the last 12 months, been added to the rateable property list in a certain category. And I'm wondering whether it might be better to get that information through that mechanism as opposed to dwellings, because sometimes...
Yeah, well, that's the lag I spoke half of the equation. I think the question Councillor Jones is saying is, well, how many are we approving, and then how many get added to the rates base constructed?
But being able to reconcile those two things together, I think it'd be really interesting for us to communicate to the public, is council's not holding this up. We're actually getting this much through the development processes, and then this is how much as being added to the rateable property list, and we can reconcile those together.
Yeah. So very broadly, in the last 10 years, we've added 50,000 rateable properties. We're doing 5 or so thousand, and that's across a whole range of different types, but it's pretty indicative of what's happening.
Yeah.
So I suppose I don't think as a council there's necessarily too much more that we can do other than receive applications and process them in an orderly fashion, which is clearly what we're trying to do.
And can I say, half of that is that we actually measure the data so we know what's going on. Like, that's critically important that we track it. So we've got a narrative and a story, and we understand. Now, that number of 5,500 when some of us first started 10 years ago was 2,500.
Yeah.
And there was incremental increases over a period of time, and we've got to a point where we're stabilising at around 5,000, which is very, very big numbers. So, Councillor Vorster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Do you want to amend my motion and build another camel?
Ouch! No, but I'll talk about another motion.
It's 5 minutes to noon.
Just on Councillor Owen Jones's earlier comment about that council resolution, it was on the 24th of November 2020 that we carried a committee resolution saying social housing supply on the Gold Coast. and we asked the Mayor to write to the Premier and some other ministers seeking some information, but including a Part E which reads, what government-funded initiatives are planned to reduce housing stress in Gold Coast City, including investment in the supply of crisis accommodation, social and managed affordable housing, housing for young people, improved housing affordability and access to the private market, and an update on the status of the redevelopment of Kibra Park and any other funded, planned or potential housing projects, and that the Premier's reply be the subject of a future report. It is now nearly 2 years. It's now nearly 2 years, and we have not received, to the best of my knowledge, that reply. And I just want to flag that it's quite absurd that ministers in the state government will smash council for not addressing a housing supply issue when, as Councillor Owen-Jones says, we're doing some heavy lifting despite the state government's resistance on progressing city plan changes, but they don't even have the courtesy of responding to this information. And it's so important that they do, because how can we plan for community infrastructure, social infrastructure and transport infrastructure if we don't know where the state government's going to plonk their acceptable development? We had a subsequent resolution demanding a response. This is after this original one. We still haven't received it.
Through you, Mr Chair, I can take that on notice. I can provide an update on Kibra Park in a closed.
Well, the thing is, Mr Chairman, it says here, any reply be subject to a future report to committee. So if there have been updates, it'd be good to know what those updates are. But what I might do is forward this to the Director, this resolution, and perhaps we need to see that information.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Else we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Any other items of general business? Meeting closed, 11:03. Thank you all.